So you guys have submitted questions from the time we really started today, and you had the ability to vote up the questions that were more popular. So if there was a question similar to the one you wanted to ask, you guys voted them up, which makes my job easy because I have them in priority by an order here.
Yes.
So the top question, Dr. Jeff, I will send this one to you, and Greg, of course, you're free. You guys are free to toss them around.
Free to disagree with Dr. Jeff.
There you go. I mean, I don't know. There's a coconut. So and hammers and such.
People used to.
I'm going to try the headbutt technique.
People used to call me Cocoa Nut.
Oh,
because
well.
I'm the Coke.
There you go.
Anyway, just saying.
Okay.
So I have a fondness in my heart.
He needs a book. He needs a book for sure. Yeah, that's probably the best. Coconut.
Treat it gently.
That could be your memoirs that you write. There we
Coconut.
go. Oh, okay. No. We're getting back. Okay. No, the top question here, what catchphrases or observable behavior would come from postmodernism and Marxism?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the observable behavior coming from a postmodernist would be people saying things like, well, that may be true for you, but not for me. I have my own truth. Who are you to say? Those kinds of things a postmodernist would say. A Marxist, it's going to be a little bit different. They might say things like that to soften you up so that the real blow comes, but it's always the real blow that's coming after they soften you up, right? A Marxist is going to claim to be a moral relativist just to get you to put your defenses down and then come at you with another kind of morality. And the morality of a Marxist worldview is what Lenin called proletariat morality. So they're always the advantaged and the disadvantaged in a Marxist worldview. Those two categories in reality don't exist in that simple of a form, but the Marxist worldview only works if you gather everybody up and then put them into those two groups so that they will fight against one another, because Marxism believes that the world advances through conflict, okay? So the proletariat morality is basically that the disadvantaged, and whatever that is in a particular situation, could be gay people versus straight people, or black people versus white people, or poor people versus rich people, or the workers versus the owners, or whatever it happens to be. Whatever advances the cause of the disadvantaged, as they see it, is morally correct. Whatever advances the cause of those who are cast as the oppressors is morally wrong.
Okay.
So this is how, in a communist society, very often you see mass murder on a stunning scale, worse in Russia and in China than even what Adolf Hitler managed to do in all of the millions of people he killed. And they justified it by saying, this is necessary and good because it advances the cause of the workers and damages the cause of the owners. Therefore, it is morally correct, and the ends justify the means. So when you hear people talking about the ends justifying the means, that's going to be one thing. Yeah. That's a pretty good trigger that the person is coming from a Marxist worldview.
Actually, more people died at the hands of Lenin, Stalin, and Mao than died independently in both world wars put together. 40 million the first, 60 million the second, over 100 million just in those three people. And this is what happens, of course, when objective truth gets replaced by some kind of personalized relative standard. The state is what determines what's right and what's wrong. Then power rules, and power can do whatever it wants, and that's what we see going on. I'm going to answer that question in reverse because, Jeff actually jumped into two areas. He started talking about Marxism, and then he started making reference to what is now what Marxism has morphed into, which is called critical race theory, CRT, because the idea of the oppressors, that is the capitalists versus the proletariat, the workers who are being oppressed and taken advantage of. That motif that was part of Marxism that didn't really play out over the last 100 years the way Marx thought it would inevitably in history play out, now is morphed into a broader thing where you have broader categories of the oppressed and the oppressors, and it is all based on being part of a group, being a member of a group. So the ironic thing is, especially since I grew up in the 50s and the 60s, and I was consciously awake through the whole civil rights movement, where to say that someone was nefarious or evil or guilty in some sense simply because they were black, just because of their skin color, that was a terrible act of prejudice that Reverend Martin Luther King fought against, and his holiday's coming up, I think, on Monday. And yet now it's all turned topsy-turvy, so that guys like Jeff and I, we're bad and oppressors principally because of our skin color, and added to that, our genders and the genders we believe we are, and our sexual orientation, and the fact that we're Christians. So we're bad like 4 ways over because of things that we have absolutely no control over except for our Christianity, okay? And so it's turned the whole civil rights movement upside down. So the Marxist mentality, so to speak, is going to be manifest, I think, in language nowadays, language reflecting what's called critical race theory, and you see this everywhere all the time.
Yeah.
Okay, so
you'll sometimes hear the term intersectionality,
Yes.
which is if you're part of a disadvantaged group, but you're part of 2 or 3 or 4 disadvantaged groups, then the intersection of all of those disadvantages puts you in a morally superior position. That's pretty much coming from a Marxist worldview.
Okay. I'm just incredible for you guys who are asking that question and we're curious about that.
And incidentally, the first question, I do agree with him. When people say, that's your truth, but not my truth. And but then the question, that's the postmodern approach. But my question is, well, but is your truth actually true? Is it actually so? I mean, that's a fair question to ask. Absolutely. And if it's only true in the sense that you believe it, then what's the difference between believe and make believe? Right. Or then none of your beliefs can be false by definition, can they? And none of my beliefs can be false by definition. So why are you telling me I'm wrong? Yeah. You know, it's just there's a little tactical maneuvering kind of squeezing.
Well,
its
wonderful,
because
really I'm sure one of the part of the question is how do I respond? Yeah. But just what do we look for and how can we respond graciously?
Used to be you could have these discussions in Philosophy 101 and it was a lot of fun. And the professor would initiate the discussion and then challenge the students. But it's getting harder to do that because truth, from a biblical worldview, we see truth as personal, as in coming in the person of Jesus Christ. Yeah. But today, people, as Greg pointed out in the story of reality, they tend to see truth as personal, as in me. I am the center of my reality. And any professor who challenges me, it's an oppressive situation.
The irony is the professor's not going to be challenging that view. He's going to be promoting that view in most of the academy.
Yeah.
Well, these guys are here. They're wanting to learn how to do this. So that actually sets us up perfectly for the next most popular question. So Melanie loves the definition of Christianity as a depiction of reality, as you were talking about, Greg. However, she and others, I'm sure, can anticipate some pushback from the students that they teach, particularly the scientifically minded students, when we get into literal biblical views on things like creationism and the age of the earth, these types of questions that come up and challenges that come up. So they feel that the students feel like these teachers are denying reality with their views. So these guys are looking for help. How do we respond?
We've never talked about this, the two of us.
No.
So I'm curious to hear what you have to say.
Well, I think this represents, now this actually speaks more to my side too, but it represents a legitimate difference of opinion within the Christian worldview. Now that means I'm not a young earther, because if people who are young earthers see this as oftentimes as a theological necessity and central to the Christian worldview. But what I would be willing to say to somebody on the outside is, if that's your complaint with Christianity, you need to know that there are a lot of Christians that hold to the Christian worldview that don't see that particular detail as essential. Okay, and so the Christian worldview writ large does not entail a commitment to that. And this is why, just historically speaking, this particular discussion is only about 100 years old, maybe 150 years old. But prior to that, it was never, this understanding about how old the universe was and how many days and how to understand all of that of Genesis 1 was not part of the foundational structure of the Christian worldview. And so without arguing one side or the other, I'd want people to understand that that is not critical here. But I'd want them to see that what is critical is something that you brought up in your lecture, Jeff, and that is that the whole scientific enterprise that we benefit from so greatly has a home in the Christian worldview and has no home in a secularist, atheistic worldview, because you have no reason to believe that today's natural laws are going to be the same tomorrow as they are today, because nothing secures that the way the founders of virtually every single discipline of science understood the universe to be. God secured that. And that's why they could do, Francis Bacon, et cetera, could formulate a system that depended upon the basic reliability of the senses, which evolution cannot give you. This is a serious problem with Darwinian evolution. If it's true, you can't trust your senses because evolution doesn't choose for truth, it chooses for survivability. It's a very different kind of thing. So in most ways, it turns out that the Christian worldview is really more supportive of science. It's not a science stopper, it was a science starter historically. And the thing that really bugs people turns out to be a thing that Christians who all hold the Christian worldview have differences of amongst themselves. So the outsider doesn't have to choose one side or another to be able to embrace the Christian worldview and the benefits and the way it explains, the explanatory power that it provides for reality.
That's a great way to answer it, because we see when students come to Summit Ministries, the thing we can be sure of is that they will have heard a lot of content on creation versus evolution. So how do we cover it uniquely? Well, we're preparing them for the university. So the primary way we do it is to help students see that it's not just the truth or falsity of the Christian worldview. Every worldview has to stand up to the test of reality. And whether they do or not is also in play. So what is the alternative if there is no personal God who created the universe on purpose and oversees it? The alternative is what's called philosophical naturalism, that says that everything that came into existence only through natural processes. No guiding hand, no intelligent design, nothing.
No purpose.
No purpose. So only the material world exists, and it came into existence through processes that were completely unguided. Okay, this is at odds with what we know to be true about the world through observation, repetition, and measurability. And it's especially important, and this is, in the philosophy class, like the professor might say, okay, prove that this exists. And that's actually fairly difficult to make the philosophical arguments to show that something like that exists.
What is it you're referring to, Professor? End of discussion.
It's a this. But things exist like justice. We wouldn't be happy in a world where I get to have my definition of justice and you get to have your definition of justice.
Contrary to
popular we all opinion. Say, well, that ought not be. Well, where do you get the idea of ought?
Right.
You see, justice is a concept that really does exist, and it exists independent of our ability to perceive it, and it does not exist as a material reality like this table. It is a mental concept. So once we recognize that mental concepts exist, this is all the big debate between the scientists and the philosophers all the way back, is what is the relationship between the mental concepts and our understanding of the mental concepts and our understanding of the physical world. And most philosophers have kind of ended something like, they call it essentialism. I don't know if we want to get into it, but it's basically that this thing produces an essence that is apparent to all of us in a similar way. We could describe our observations of it and they would be similar because it produces an essence that's consistent. But the same would be true then of love or justice or truth or all of those things that are mental concepts. And the weirdest thing of all is when a scientist says only the material world exists and they expect you to take that argument, which is a mental concept based on the laws of logic, and then just assume that it's true. It's like the person who says the whole universe is a vacuum, therefore nothing exists.
Oh boy.
But a vacuum is not nothing, right? So they're changing up the terms as they go through the debate. That's probably a lot more information than you wanted, but maybe it'll be helpful.
I think it's helpful and relevant. And
Good stuff.
we talked about the coconut again, which is also a plus.
The coconut's right in front of me.
It's
so this,
just a great...
it's producing an essence.
Let me jump back to the original part of the question, though, just a final sentence, because it is a huge mistake that's made by a lot of Christians to assume that if they meet another Christian who is not a young earther, they must be an evolutionist. And that is not the case most of the time, although there is that category, okay? So that's not the case with me because I reject Darwinism, classical Darwinism entirely, the macro-Darwinian model. But even though I think that the universe is not 4,000, 6,000, 10,000 years old, however people want to characterize it. So just wanted to make that point.
People will argue and debate over these things, but I think, I think this is an in-house scrimmage. This is the A team, B team, whatever. They're playing one another to sharpen themselves. But when you start seeing Christians lobbing arguments at one another in public, it's pretty rough because it's very discouraging to students to think that if we can't have a civil discussion about something like that, what can we have a civil discussion about? It's easier just to leave that behind. Because they're not thinking at the time, well, if I reject that set of arguments, then I'm going to have to I'll be in a whole new group of people who disagree with one another on a multitude of things. They're just kind of reacting.
Yeah, and I mean, so I'm going to bring everything that we just said down to a very practical level because we have a lot of teachers among us, a lot of administrators, parents, and you guys are not just speakers and educators, you're parents too. And so just to kind of tie in several...
the scars to prove it.
The scars, don't we all? It's a wonderful adventure though. So just to tie in a couple questions together, what I'm hearing is how do we take these things into a classroom setting? How do we talk about these current events that we're seeing, how they might relate to the end of the story, and do it in such a way where our students are not going to become embittered with the gospel by the time they leave school or afraid because of the types of things that are happening and the way that we're talking about them. That's a lot, but I'm wondering just in our last couple of minutes if we could speak to that. Everybody.
Well, this is kind of where the rubber meets the road, yeah, yes. And a lot of it depends on the individual circumstance that you're facing. And people ask me, how to use a tactic against an atheist. I say, well, what did the atheist just say? And then I'll know how to respond to that particular thing. But I think maybe a general approach in this situation would be to look at something that the culture has produced. It could be a book, it could be a movie, it could be an advertisement, it could be a meme. And ask the question, what is being assumed about the nature of reality in this meme? What is being assumed about the nature of reality in this meme or whatever thing is in question? And what you're going to see is two different things consistently. You're either going to see what I call the inside-out quality, and this is actually a tactic in the book where it trades on the idea that every human being is made in the image of God, and therefore they can't keep that image from expressing itself. So human beings are moral creatures, and even if they're relativists when they're trying to defend their own view, they can't help but speaking like common sense moral realists when they're not trying to guard their own turf, okay? But what also is going to come out is their fallenness and their other things where they're going to speak their narcissistic relativism. And so the question then becomes, what assumption is being expressed here? Sometimes the assumption is, like when somebody says, what about so much evil in the world? Well, the assumption is there's evil in the world. And you're an atheist? Well, how can there be evil if there's no God? Can you explain that to me? So what we're doing is we're taking his assertion and showing that his assertion assumes something inconsistent with his worldview. Okay, or if the assertion is on the other side on a relativistic notion, okay, then the rebellious side that's being expressed, okay, then we can the false side is always going to be inconsistent with reality at some point, and so our job is to show now what is the Christian response to this false view of reality, and how then can we demonstrate that the Christian worldview makes better sense of that than their worldview makes of it.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's not about every individual debating point. It's about the total picture.
Yeah.
That's why what Greg talked about with the story of reality is so important. And,
Yes.
and my answer to that question, I get to 26 minutes and just a few minutes to talk about a worldview of everything. So
We've set you right up for that.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Yes, and not only that, but through story, and it's not just that it's true, it's beautiful. It's just, and it is captivating. So for those who become embittered, it makes me wonder, have they not caught?
You know, I'm so glad you
beauty of
mentioned
that.
because I wrote this book also, not just for Christians to understand the story, but for non-Christians. It doesn't have a lot of Christian lingo. It's got soft apologetics in it, but I wanted them to see the elegance of the Christian story, okay? It's sublime. It's not only, it doesn't have persuasive power because it explains things that need to be explained in a coherent way, but there's a beauty and an elegance to it. It's a good story with a great ending if you take its advice, if you see reality clearly.
Yeah, so the story to champion all stories. And guys, these books that we're mentioning, The Secret Battle of Ideas About God, The Story of Reality, these are all available at the Summit Bookstore at summit.org for those of you who didn't win a copy or are curious and want to get a hold of one. So we're going to go to break, and at this break, you guys are going to hear about another one of our wonderful partners who is sponsoring and helping with this event to happen today, the Waterhouse Lecture Series. So Alec and Belle Waterhouse were just a wonderfully generous family that lived in Hawaii. Alec founded the Waterhouse Incorporated, so a corporation that allowed him to be generous with his community, support organizations in his community doing good work. And in their name, this lecture series was developed. It's actually funded by a trust that Alec set up several years ago. And it's a ministry of YLI Baptist Church. And so you're going to hear a bit about the lecture series. These lectures are free, you guys. You can attend them virtually, so pay close attention to the lecture series that's coming up in the next few months. With that, we'll see you after the break.